So, and I've been doing a stint in administration for about 5 years. So, my research enterprise has sort of been not grinding to a complete halt, but it's definitely slowed down. But I've been thinking a lot about scale and I'm sort of working on an article, and this was a great opportunity. So, like, double thanks, right? Nothing like a deadline to get you off your ass, right? And do a little work. So, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is laid out in the article. I share a link to that at the end. But I'm working on updating it as well. So I think I'm going to talk a bit about scale, and then absolutely welcome your questions and observations and so on, which I will happily steal and roll into something. So I've had the good fortune of seeing some of the prior presentations in this series, and I've been thinking a lot about scale in general. And I guess I'm going to invite people to take a step back a little bit, right? And I know this is sort of tongue in cheek, this question, like, does scale exist? But we'll dig into that. It actually is a good question, I think. So first of all, what is scale, right? It's fair to say that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of publications on scale. There's many funding programs on scale. And so just this morning, working on this presentation, I went to NSF and I kind of just sort of did a quick search on scale. And these are the top hits. Clearly, some of them refer to like research infrastructure, right? But a lot of them refer to ideas around scale, whether it's physics, it's biology, you got climate change, right? Scale is clearly a thing, right? It's a shorthand we use for a lot of different ideas. I'm talking primarily to geographers here, I assume. I'm actually looking at the participant list, and I recognize a lot of your names. Glad you're here. Lots of geographers. We think a lot about scale. I'm sure you're finding, just as much as I am, that plenty of fields are interested in scale. Fields that maybe even 10, 20 years ago weren't too concerned about it in the way they weren't too concerned about space. They're discovering space, they're discovering scale as a result. I'd argue that fields that are looking more intensively at human environment interactions are really getting into scale as well. So lots of publications, lots of programs, lots of fields, and of course, many terms and uses, right? And there's no lack of articles and presentations and so on the various terms we attach to scale. And so we'll look at a few of those right now too. So big picture though, and this is a really great overview by Sayre, if you ever, if you want another view on this. This was a chapter in one of those companions to environmental geography. And this, in some ways, this quote kind of captures where we are as a discipline, right? And you can read this, I won't read it to you, but scale is absolutely fundamental. It's a fundamental challenge. And I would agree with Sayre that even 10 years on, it is sort of unclear what we mean by scale and how to use it. And I take Sayre's point here that within geography, this confusion is particularly acute. I guess I would sort of like re-articulate that a little bit and just say that I think geographers think a lot about scale, probably more than a lot of other disciplines do, right? And there's clearly folks in other disciplines who are intensely interested in scale, but scale has always been pretty central to the geographic imagination and the geographic project. So I think if we are confused, you can see it in a good light. It just means we have a lot of different perspectives on scale, and I think that's a healthy thing. So, so two other little quotes, and I promise it won't all just be text here. So there was a real explosion of activity around scale in the 90s, right? There's clearly work before that and after that, but there was this kind of particularly fruitful period in the 90s and moving into the early 2000s. Special issues on scale. This is, I know, a GIS-oriented seminar series, and I think GIS has always been interested in scale the way cartography has. But, when you saw the NCGIA and the UCGIS, these various sort of structured engagements with ideas in GIS, scale always bubbled up to the top, right? Whether it was position papers or particular foci or so on. So the 90s were a good time to be thinking about this. And there's these two sort of quotes that I found that kind of really got me thinking, right? The first one is Sue Ruddock, who's at Toronto. And, this idea that scale is not predetermined, right? It's not necessarily just sort of out there or given, it's actually produced, right? Scales are actually produced in the act of creating and contesting social identity, right? And this was a major theme in human geography, and we'll talk about that. But then, on the other hand, and here I'm looking at Chip Blount, scale, it's not really sort of constructed, right? It's not created. It's just sort of out there, right? And if all humans were removed from the world, which we're working on in some ways right now, but let's, move past that. If humans didn't exist, there'd probably still be scales out there, right? I think both folks are correct, right? The devil's always in the detail here. So moving from these quotes, and this is sort of the heart of my presentation today, is that I think we need to be okay with multiple definitions of scale and multiple theories of scale, right? And there's various ways of arraying scale theories. I would argue that one of the most fruitful ways of doing this is to sort of think about them in terms of their epistemological basis, right? And keep in mind, big picture, right? We have ontology and epistemology, right? Ontology is sort of what we can know, the nature of reality, such as it is. And epistemology is sort of like, well, how do we go about knowing what we can know, right? It's sort of a theory of knowledge. And we all have epistemologies, right? Whether we recognize them or not. So the way I think about scale, and I'd argue it's a fruitful way of thinking about scale, is to say, look, there's multiple competing definitions. It could be that some definitions do better than others given the circumstance. And so the way to think about it is like, look at a continuum of epistemological foci, right? You can bookend this continuum, and this is true for sort of epistemology in general, through think about it as sort of on the one end, you have a bookend in terms of what we call logical positivism, which doesn't really exist as sort of an ongoing philosophy anymore. It's been sort of superseded, but it's kind of a good anchoring point, and basically it just says, look, there's a single shared reality out there, and through careful observation, measurement, theory building, you can start to make truth statements about that reality, right? And flavors of realism undergird a lot of scientific enterprise, right? Like myself, what we call a critical realist. And I won't go into that, but there's a lot of geography that happens there. You go all the way to the other end of the continuum down here, relativism. Again, this is one of the most sort of argued about philosophical kind of concepts out there, but taken to an extreme, and very few people actually practice at this extreme, right? Is the idea that we actually can't know. There may actually be an ontological entity out there in the real world, but we have so many blinders and we have so much positionality and so on that it could be that we could have multiple equivalents of reality out there, right? When taken to an extreme, this is sort of, it's caricatured, right? It's like, well, any truth is good as any other truth, right? There's limits to that, but there's a lot of really good work out there showing that we have limits to language, we have limits to observation. There's an extraordinary amount of good work done on sort of how, basic features of ourselves can condition the kind of knowledge we have about the world, right? So this is the continuum right there, right? And again, I'll bookend it sort of with these extremes, but really most of our work happens more towards the center of the continuum, right? And so, and again, you can read the article. I'm just going to sort of hit some high points here and offer some updates to it. But you can argue that we kind of have these clusters, right? We kind of got realism, realist scales, and so on here. You've got some work on hierarchies. I'm going to just use that as a shorthand. And then you have sort of the construction arguments, and they kind of go into networks. And so I'm going to move along this epistemological scale continuum and highlight work that is going on and how it matters to the kind of work that all you good people are doing in your day-to-day research lives. So, and Taylor, I'll rely on you. If people want to jump in with like a really quick clarifying question, they always can. Otherwise, we can kind of go through and then have questions at the end as well. So
Sure. And if folks want to pop a question or comment in the chat or the Q&A, because I don't think they can unmute at this point, I'm happy to MC those out. And then at the end, I can either do the same or I can unmute folks as interested.
great. And here, tell you what, I'm also gonna, this is bad presentation style, I know, but here's a link to the presentation. If you have any internet issues or whatever, it's a PDF that you can link to directly. So, alrighty. So, okay, so what do we mean by realist scales? I think realist scales are front and center in GIS, right? There's this world out there. We're scientists. We are really interested in measuring it, developing hypotheses, developing theories from that. There's a general sense that it is a sort of shared world. And I could argue that, say, most of the natural sciences and a lot of ecological and biological sciences tend to fall on this end of the continuum. And, so I'm looking down the list of participants here, for instance, I'm seeing people like Ellen Kuklalis is here. This Michael Goodchild guy is here. Plenty of folks, so we have a lot of Ying Song, who's in my institution. I think, Deanne, are you on this one too? I think you are, actually. Very exciting. So I'm talking to the people who actually been working on this forever, and doing an extraordinary job at it, right? So when we talk about realist scales, we're often interested in, say, this dyad, right, of sort of resolution and extent, also termed the scale of measurement and the scale of observation, right? And there's so much good work being produced on this, right? The idea of, so, well, how does resolutions, we can look at these three images down here, for instance. So you've got, these are just captures from the Jensen 2000 book for remote sensing, saying, here's a single extent called part of an urban, suburban neighborhood. And you can see how resolution changes over time, right? From a 1 by 1 meter pixel on up to the 80 by 80, good old MSS data. A lot of the work that we do as geographers is focused on, well, how do resolution and extent let us answer types of questions? How do changes in resolution and extent change the kinds of questions we can't ask, and so on? I feel like a lot of our engagement with other disciplines is often right here and saying, hey, your model results are going to change when you change the resolution and so on, right? This work also focuses a lot on sort of what you can call the different terms. They all roughly mean the same thing. I think operational scale was very popular early on, but characteristic scale, the scale of explanation or process, the idea that, we know there's a bit of a gap between, say, a pixel as captured by a remote sensing platform and the actual processes we're trying to capture, right? And so I still do a bit of work in land use, and we use remotely sensed imagery all the time, but it's always a bit of a challenge linking the pixel, right? Whether it's a thematic mapper pixel or something smaller to, say, a field, right? Because a farm field or a farming household is actually sort of where a lot of the decision making happens, right? And it's divorced from the pixels until we make that linkage in GIS. And then realist scales are often also interested in spatial temporal scales, right? So we often think of sort of GIS as being primarily spatial, but so much of the work we do is also temporal, right? And so this leads us to work like the idea of scale dependence and variance. And again, this is one of the biggest gifts that geographers have given to the world, right? This idea that things happen at certain spatial and temporal scales. So right here, for instance, I'm borrowing Meyer's sort of scales of biogeosphere, right? So here we have spatial scale running down the left hand, or sort of, the left-hand axis, and on the bottom axis, we have time, right? And this is a very powerful idea, this idea that certain phenomena are best understood and studied, right? And so if you're interested in a forest stand, This is something you look at over a year to 10 years to 100 years, right? That's how long they last, give or take. And you could be looking at sort of one here is a square kilometer, right? So you start to go down to sort of, a tenth of a kilometer or lower than that to the sort of, forest stands and trees. And this is where we spend a lot of our time as scientists, right? Is trying to identify how scale dependent a given phenomena is, and then how that phenomena varies over space and time, right? So this is a powerful idea, a lot of work there. Related to that is this idea that you can have scale dependence and variance and how it relates to prediction, right? A lot of the work we do as scientists is sort of oriented towards describing things and explaining them. But as we've seen, well, we're seeing it this week, right? Climate change, weather, where's COVID going in the next little bit? Probably not summer great, honestly. A lot of our job is sort of focused on how we predict into the future. And scale is integral, right, to those sort of questions, right? And so here I'm boring after Wines, 1989 here, this idea that we often see space-time scaling in phenomena, right? And here he describes this idea of like high predictability, right? And so if we think back to say the tree example we're looking on the previous slide here, you can say, well, say I'm looking at extent here, and this is meters squared now, not kilometers. So, somewhere in here, right, you can say, well, you have a stand of trees, it's a couple hundred meters aside, a couple hundred kilometers aside. You can be pretty certain that that stand of trees is going to be there in 100 days or 1,000 days, right? Sort of barring a big forest fire or something like that. And they're still sort of there. They're just very deconstructed. When you get off of the central axis, though, right, you start to sort of run into other things like high apparent predictability, right? So same thing with, if I'm looking at my trees and they're sort of right here, I can be pretty sure that those trees are going to be here within, say, a single day, which would kind of put you right here, or within an hour from now, right? No matter how fast moving that fire is, it's going to be there. The term high apparent predictability is used here, though, to kind of capture this idea that you're not really capturing some underlying process. It just appears predictable because it's a big thing in a short amount of time, right? And then if you flip down to the other side over here, you move to low predictability, right? And you're like, well, sure, my trees are here, but I can't be sure those trees are going to be there, 1,000 days or 10,000 days here and so on, right? And so a lot of interesting kind of realistic scale work or realism in scale is sort of focused on trying to push these boundaries out. How well can we predict and how can we change the scale prediction? And we see remarkable successes here, right? You look at weather forecasting, right? We can always complain about weather forecasting, but in my lifetime, the shifts have been extraordinary, right? We've moved from hours and days to weeks in some cases for weather prediction. It's remarkable. You could argue that one of the fundamental challenges of our time is climate change, right? And that's the essence of prediction, right? And the better we get there, the better off we'll be. Well, insofar as we can be better off. So dependence, variance, prediction. I will say though, there's an interesting sort of sub-thread of sort of realist scale work that looks at the idea of scale and variance, right? And this is the idea that there are some phenomena, potentially a growing amount of phenomena, that can be characterized in ways that sort of almost ignore scale, right? And a lot of this work is sort of tied to fractals and complexity and so on. So I have my obligatory sort of set of images here, right? And the idea that, say you look at fluvial geomorphology or the shape of rivers, there's a lot of interest in sort of trying to see whether there are scale and variant processes, right? So you can look at an itty-bitty part of a stream reach or the entire river, and then trying to establish whether processes that happen at one scale either exist at another scale or the process that happens at the other scale produces the same results, right? The example here in the center here is the idea of, say, forest fires, right, which is clearly a big thing right now, unfortunately. And there's a lot of interesting work trying to say, look, can we predict fires? There's related work going with earthquakes, for instance, too. Is there something about the underlying processes of forest fires and how they relate to climate and other sort of phenomena in the world that would let us sort of predict the potential of a fire happening in a given place? Or here, you know, the idea of can you predict a number of large fires, right? So it's sort of like the other side of the coin from sort of the spatial dependence argument, the idea that instead of there being a single temporal spatial scale, there actually it's a uniform kind of relationship that happens over scale, and you try to capture that. So. All right, so I'm going to take a quick sort of sideways pause here and just say, I've been talking primarily in terms of sort of what we do as GI scientists, right? But of course, the work we do have all these real world impacts, right? So I look at, say, adaptive management, right? And this is the field of trying to manage natural resources or some other sort of system in the face of uncertainty, right? And you could argue a lot of the interesting problems we run into are kind of due to uncertainty. We just don't quite know what's going to happen, even if you think of sort of space-time predictivity and so on. So, you know, this is a process basically of adaptive management. I don't have time to go into it too much here, but the idea that you're constantly iteratively learning about a system, you're measuring it, you're making tweaks, and then seeing what those sort of tweaks do, right? So here you're really interested in, say, issues of scale identification, right? What's the best place to look at a problem, right? If I'm interested in, say, biodiversity, I need to know a lot about that species, right? And then I need to know about its habitat, right? There's no point in me trying to preserve the habitat of a particular bird species, for instance, if it ranges, say, tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers. There's no point looking at backyard neighborhoods, right? Unless you're looking at collections of backyard neighborhoods. Scale linkages, right? How do my backyard neighborhoods link to the broader ecosystem for these birds, right? This notion of, say, optimal scales, right? We see this a lot in habitat protection work, right? The idea that there may be optimal habitat sizes or connectivity and so on that can really be effective, right? And then, you know, this whole idea of process versus pattern, right? You know, we're good geographers. We know that it's not just about sort of the patterning of something in space, but it's also the process, right? And every one of these things has a scale dynamic to it, whether we realize it or not. I will point to some other really nice work, you know, in the realist space or the realist scale camp. You can't really look at, say, identifying scales, scale linkages, optimal scales, process versus pattern without encountering, say, MALP, right, the modifiable real unit problem. This is, you know, I'm assuming we're mostly on the same page here, right? But this is the idea that, you know, you can have a single cardinal data set, like, say, you know, panel A here, right? Imagine these are, I don't know, households and the number of people and the number of televisions, right? 5 people in this household, 3 televisions. In this household, 4 people and 5 televisions. This is where my kids would like to be. They're not going to get there. You know, you can look at these households, you know, say you're doing surveys or whatever, but then you decide you want to start to aggregate or scale up in space, right? We call that the aggregation problem, right? Or you want to zone them differently. You know, we know this is one of the fundamental problems in GI science. While you can take these basic data, so this A panel here, and you could rearticulate them, right? So B, C, and D are different ways of sorting these data. Here we have, say, 4 zones. Let's jump up to this one though, C and D. Here we have sort of 8 sort of areas that we've sort of aggregated these, the underlying observations into, but their orientation is a little different, right? And you know, this is interesting. You know, they have the same means, right, in X and Y, but they have different apparent correlations, right? particularly compared to A, right, where there is clearly a relationship between the number of people and the number of TVs in the house, and it's a good relationship, but it's, 0.66 versus say 0.98, right, E, right, just by rezoning, right, and re-aggregating these same underlying data, we get different results, right? And we know this is one of the biggest challenges in GI science, and it's an ongoing research area. I can see, maybe not dozens, but there's certainly numbers of people in the participant list today who have looked at this problem, right? It's an ongoing issue. This is something that I think geographers really bring to the table when they work with other disciplines and say, look, and these other disciplines are not blind to it often, but the idea of, looking at scale carefully, trying to relate, say, the scale of measurement to the scale of observation to sort of how scale can change it, can actually lead to different results is very, very important. Same too with the idea of scale dependence and autocorrelation. I think it's all well and good to say that the phenomena in the world are scale dependent, right? And we can often measure that through spatial autocorrelation metrics. But we know full well, though, right, that if we are to say go from a basic tessellation, right, say we're just using remotely sensed imagery, one of the cheapest ways to change a measure like Moran's eye, a measure of spatial autocorrelation, is simply just to subdivide, right, or aggregate observations, right? And I think people actually do this all the time without realizing it, right? If they're using imagery with a certain set resolution and then they decide to either run a filter on it, right, or do some kind of aggregation, they're going to go see impacts on the spatial autocorrelation, right? And so there's a lot of neat work happening at the boundary, and I'm sort of pointing down here at the boundary of remote sensing and GIS, trying to really capture that. And there's been dozens of papers looking at how scale affects autocorrelation, but our work is clearly not done. All right, so I'm going to sort of argue that this work, the realist end of the continuum, is probably pretty familiar to GI science, right? In some ways, this is our bread and butter. This is also bread and butter for other disciplines, right? So I'm here looking at, say, climate change and so on, right? We start to move into the notions of hierarchy, and hierarchy is in the middle of the continuum, I would argue, right? You can still have, like, say, a realist hierarchy, so closer to the realist end of the continuum. Well, here we're trying to identify scale levels, right? The idea that there may be certain groups of entities or observations, there's a certain measurement and resolution at work that sort of makes sense, right? And it is sort of related, going back to the idea of scale dependence, right? The idea that there are sort of ideal scales to be looking at certain entities. Realist hierarchical scales go one step further and say, well, how do elements down here relate to elements up here, right? And we often do think about this in terms of, say, imagery or modeling, right? So here's an example of some folks in the Netherlands looking at how you can, say, downscale global climate models, right, of which there are several sort of families, getting those down to regional climate models, right? And then actually down to local area models, right? And so these guys were looking at how do you go from global climate models, which tend to be some of our most accurate overall, and then downscale that to a lower level, right? What will precipitation in 50 years look like according to a global climate model, play out in local urban rainfall and runoff and things like that. There's an extraordinary amount of work going on in this area, and it's very important, right? And part of it is just purely computational, right? In the sense that it's the GCMs, the global climate models, are very expensive to run on computers. They take quite a while. And so we move towards regional climate models, which tend to be easier to run, but they also do capture, say, the effects of regional topology and local topography, sorry, not topology. And then the same thing can be said for local area models, right? It's one thing to know you're going to get 3 inches of rain over the course of a day. It's another thing to know exactly which, say, highways are going to get flooded and so on, right? And I feel almost a little bad bringing up that example right now, given the events in China and in London. But these are very real challenges we're facing right now, right? And so, kind of a hierarchical scale from a realist perspective is about how do we best model certain phenomena, right, and then link it across scales. There was a lot of work about 10 years ago on this, and it still continues, particularly in ecology and other areas.
Steve, I got one comment that might be relevant that you might want at this point. So this was
actually, why don't we do that?
This was coming from Andy Anderson, and they said regarding predicting weather versus climate, they've always thought of the latter as easier because it's looking at a relatively closed system, allowing predictions over a larger scale and longer term, while the former is looking at smaller scales, but in effectively open systems. So you can predict only over a short period of time.
Absolutely. This is a really good comment. And it's actually perfect timing because in the next slide, we're actually going to start to getting into that idea, right? But I will say, just as a highlight to build off of this, the idea of, say, realist scales is all about defining the object of study and the level we want to look at it. As soon as you do that, you start cutting out the other levels, right? You're arguing for this is the best level to look at it for. So when we look at, say, the weather system, the phenomena tend to be much more variable, right? Instead of, say, looking at average precipitation over the course of a year, you're saying, am I going to get rained on? And then weather also tends to be a more regionally oriented phenomena, right? And again, you run into these time-space scales where, our regional estimates of weather are like pretty fantastic right now in some ways at certain time scales. Beyond that, who knows, right? Over the longer time scales, I have a pretty good idea where the climate's going to be, a month from now, 3 months from now. So, but this is good. Let's keep this in mind for the next couple of slides, right? So sort of moving towards the middle of the continuum here, there's been some really interesting work in ecology in particular, right, and biogeography and so on, where people make a distinction between exclusive hierarchies and inclusive hierarchies, right? So going beyond just looking at levels and saying, well, how do these levels relate to each other, right? So the classic exclusive hierarchy are, say, looking at a food pyramid or something like that, versus an inclusive hierarchy, which tends to be more about how scale levels contain each other, right? And one of the classic examples here is, so you got trees make sense as part of stands, right? And then stands make sense as being part of forests and so on. There's a lot of work on how you define these hierarchies, right? And it's good and it's important work. Again, I think a lot of the work in ecology in particular has done remarkable things here. But I look at fields that, geographers regularly interface with, say, like land change science and so on, right? And the idea of, if I'm looking at deforestation in some part of the world, I can think about it in terms of just remote sensing and tracking change in area over time and so on. But I can also start to think about it in terms of inclusive hierarchies, right? Instead of trees, I keep looking at households or individuals within households, and then how they interface with, say, co-ops or communities, right? Which would be sort of the next level of the hierarchy. And then up from there, you could start to look at, just state policies matter. And they start to nest within each other there. So you have inclusive and exclusive hierarchies. And then about 20 years ago, I'm going to say that, less than that, this notion of emergent hierarchical scales really came into being. And a lot of this was sort of in parallel with the work of complexity. It's still going on. And this kind of wraps back to Andy's question a little bit here. It's this idea that, maybe a lot of these scale levels, they aren't necessarily as given as we think they are, right? There's a lot of power to pre-made scale levels, right? I have a lot of economist friends or colleagues and friends. And we tend to look at things like households and firms, right? Or states as these sort of pre-built containers for how the economy works, right? But sometimes it's useful to push up against that a little bit though, and say, well, it could be that you have a lot of locally interacting components or agents, right? Individual decision makers. And sometimes these individual decision makers can act in ways that almost make it look like they're acting in concert, right? And in essence, they create their own higher level entity, right? One example that I've been running into a fair amount lately is a project I have right now with colleagues where we're looking at dairy farming, right? And traditionally, the view we take here is you have individual dairy farmers or firms, right? And then they sort of, they make decisions on the landscape, they sell their milk and so on. And then that sort of influences the larger market. You see increasingly intentional and unintentional aggregations of folks, right? An intentional one would be co-ops, right? So joining together entities at this level, individual farmers and households, joining together to create basically a new entity at a higher scale that emerges out of their interactions, right? You have accidental versions of that too, right? Through sort of informal learning communities, right? Where if one farmer implements a new innovation, right? There's been a real move towards more pasture-fed dairying, for instance, in the Midwest, right? As feed grows in cost and so on. And as soon as you get one or two folks doing that, and other folks see that as successful, and it's a way to sort of reduce uncertainty about feed availability and so on, then you'll get more people joining into that, and then you create a new entity that way as well. So there's plenty of examples here, but the key thing here is that this notion of emergent hierarchical scale starts to really foreground the observer in a way that, say, realist scales they're aware of, they don't quite go as far in that direction, right? So the idea here of like trying to really look carefully at your system and say, well, I'm interested in, say, level 0, right? Whatever that level happens to be, maybe it's the dairy landscape or whatever. And then trying to establish where there are boundaries and other entities, right, within that, and trying to sort of develop new sort of scalar hierarchies that can let you ask different kinds of questions. And again, there's many benefits to this, but one of the key benefits is it tends to sort of try problematize accepted categories, right, in terms of sort of what's going on the ground. And it also gets to some of the prediction issues that Andy was talking about here, right, and saying, well, how are different sort of phenomena, different scales related to each other, right? So, going back to the weather idea, you can have sort of weather happening in a particular area at level 0, but it's clearly tied to these larger state variables, right? The overall aggregate amount of moisture in the air, whether we're seeing a heat wave propagate across the continent, or even bigger picture changes in climate, right? I know one of the biggest conversations we're having right now is to what extent are extreme weather events linked to climate. I think most of the folks I work with say they're careful to say, look, any one given event probably can't be conclusively related to global climate change. Series of events or general characteristics like increase in intensity or increase in frequency can very likely be related, right? And that's where you start to see thinning boundaries between these levels, as well as a stronger role for the sort of the state variables, so the things we're measuring between them. So, and then this last thought for the emergent hierarchical scales is that you also sort of open up the door to nonlinearities, right? A lot of our other scale knowledge, or ways of thinking about it in terms of, say, exclusive hierarchy or inclusive hierarchy, are really conditioned on the idea that there are these boundaries between them, right? And instead of there's these tree stand forest relationships, or you go from plants up to the top carnivore. The work on sort of emergent hierarchical scales really opened up the door to the idea of nonlinearities, right? Whether it's a butterfly effect or whether it's something like, the change in a sea current in one part of the world affecting climate or weather in another part of the world. We've long known that these things exist. They tend to make scale more difficult though, right? Because it upsets our sort of either the inclusive hierarchies of things kind of being contained into each other, right? Or in more smoothly varying sort of continuums, like the scale invariance and so on. So, so that's kind of the middle of it. Pause 1 second. All right. Any questions right now about the kind of the middle part of the continuum? There's a lot of good work happening here. I just feel like I can't really do it justice in the amount of time we have right now. So take one minute here for questions if you have questions. And to look at my dog who's looking right at me. Sorry, buddy. Not going out right now.
I don't know
All
if you
right.
popped in the chat. Yeah, I think we're good to keep on going.
All right, let's motor then. Okay, so realism, that's where a lot of the work happens, right? There's these subsets of emergent kind of middle of the continuum kind of work. Within geography, though, as a field, I would argue that most of the folks on this call, broad brush here, I know, maybe I'm being unfair here, tend to be a bit more towards the realist end of the continuum. That's where a lot of GIS happens. That's where we interface with our colleagues and so on. The last 15, 20, 25 years, particularly in human geography, has been intensely interested in kind of new theoretical frameworks. I could have all sorts of commentary on those. A lot of it's great, some of it's not so great. I think you could say the same thing about GIS. Most of it's great, some of it's not so great. Really interesting work, though, be done on this idea of the social construction of scale, right? And there's a ton going on here. Oops. The simplest way I could think about it right now is that scale, and by scale, I mean, this is a bit of a grab bag, but you could talk about sort of nature as well, right? It's sort of actively formed and reformed according to sort of social, economic, cultural, and political goals, right? This work is really focused on the idea that, say, accepted scale levels can be the product, not of something just there in reality that we're saying, yeah, that's the natural scale level for that thing, but more a product of an explicit construction, the way that we look at it, right? So here's an example that lets me think about it, right? I live in Minnesota, Minneapolis, it's great. The Mississippi runs through the city, right? And actually the headwaters of the Mississippi are at a place called Itasca State Park, and that's what this is here. So there's this little bridge of rocks, right? So you can say, yeah, I walked across the Mississippi River the other day. So this is a lot of fun, right? And then of course we have the Mississippi that runs through the Twin Cities as well. But of course, you know, when you actually look at, say, the watershed, right, in the Mississippi, and that'd be this sort of picture here that I stole from Wikipedia, you know, it's a big chunk of the US. Heck, it's even a tiny bit of Canada as well, right? So this is clearly an entity, right, the Mississippi, that can be looked at in multiple scales, right? And we can certainly take like a realist view on scales and say, well, if I'm really interested in learning more about where all the water comes from, I'll look at the watershed, right? Or if I'm interested in engaging into the ongoing debate in Minneapolis about how to redevelop the waterfront, I would look at the waterfront, right? It gets trickier when you start to look at problems and conundrums, right? So flooding is a big deal, right? It's clearly a big deal right now. Flooding is one of these little known facts that flooding is actually one of the most damaging types of natural disasters. You know, it's a little less flashy in some ways, but it does a lot of damage. And a lot of the conversations around flooding, particularly in the Midwest, but you know, further down downstream as well on the Mississippi, sort of get into scale dynamics really quickly. And a lot of it is constructed, right, in the sense that, you know, should we think of the Mississippi in its entirety? So the kind of actions that I do here, right, or communities in the Midwest take, how closely linked should they be to stuff happening downstream, right? They are absolutely linked in a realist sense, right? In the sense that land use behaviors here are going to have impacts on what happens down south. The same thing with say, runoff from agricultural fields, right? Corn is a really big deal in Minnesota, maybe not as big as it is in, say, Iowa, but it's a big deal, right? A lot of sediment and pesticides and other kind of inputs wash off the fields, right? Particularly since a lot of agriculture is tile-based, which means that there's just a layer of hard substance under the fields that promotes runoff of water, excess water. All that has to go somewhere. Where does it go? It goes down the Mississippi, of course, right? So what happens is it all kind of runs out at the end into the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the results are these dead zones. And all these little itty bitty things here are dead fish. Hundreds of thousands of dead fish, right? And, there's an ongoing debate about what's causing sort of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, but clearly one of the contributors is very likely, right, is sort of the sediment and all the other kind of gunk that runs off fields here, right, and then sort of ends up down there. It's a really fraught political conversation, right, where there'll be one part of the conversation is say, look, the proper scale analysis for this issue is we're growing corn here in Minnesota, and what's happening downstream isn't really our problem, right? In the sense that it's sort of happening elsewhere, right? While people talking about the scale of the problem, where the river runs into the ocean, I have a different view on these things, right? And this is just one example. I think another fascinating example of just all the water conversations happening in the West right now, right? Same sort of thing. What is the scale of analysis, right? And there's always going to be this contestation between saying the scale analysis should be local when it makes sense to those folks versus something broader and so on, right? There's plenty of examples around this. I think another example is just, climate change is definitely on everyone's mind right now, right? It's a deeply political kind of issue, right? In the sense that, plenty of folks on this call, right, and more broadly within geography are working on climate change. We can certainly look at it through the realist lens, right? And say, well, I want to better understand how emissions in one place lead to climate change in another place in the world. But the other part of the conversation in terms of defining the scales at which we analyze it are deeply political, right? And we've seen this with, say, not to get too political here, but that's what we're talking about. The Harper administration in Canada or various administrations within the US, right? Where, the government and government agencies have been sort of either told directly or encouraged often to redefine the scale analysis for climate change to avoid certain types of questions, right? We know that, right? The Union of Concerned Scientists had a great report that came out 8-9 years ago now, just sort of pointing out all the various ways in which we structured the research enterprise, change the language we use, and change the scales we use in order to guide certain types of questions, right? And so, these I love cartoons, right? And so they often kind of capture the essence of things, right? So often, a lot of the climate change talks we have are very much focused on the nation state, right, as the primary locus of control. We do that because often there are sort of nation state level controls, but we're seeing here in the US in particular where, cities and states are actually going ahead and redefining the scale of the climate change conversation because they don't think that the conversation is happening at other scales, right? A lot of the political conversations we have are along these lines, right? The idea of sort of looking at certain types of emissions in certain areas, right, versus other ones, right? Or, harkening back to my dissertation research, again, rescaling where we see climate change being caused, right? And say we're going to focus on deforestation and not focus so much on why things are being deforested, right? Where are all those soybeans going that are being grown in the Amazon, right? Well, they're ending up places outside of the Amazon. Anyway, we could go, I could go on forever and ever. I will look at one other example, and this is an example of what in human geography is becoming known as scale jumping, right? The idea, and this is like a kind of a non-linearity, where it's a particular a political or social strategy to say, look at, right, a big charismatic animal like the polar bears, right? Who doesn't love polar bears? Well, I think if you're actually near a polar bear, you probably wouldn't love the polar bear, but in the abstract, right, we have plenty of people who've never seen a polar bear, never been run down by a polar bear, but they've become a symbol, right, for climate change, right? You know, there's hundreds of these cartoons out there if you do a Google search, right? And this is the idea that change that's happening to a non-human entity at the end of the earth should be influencing our behavior, right? It's a way that an intensely local phenomenon is quickly jumping past all sorts of normal, what we think is of inclusive or exclusive scale levels, right? And speaking to a global problem, climate change, and then bouncing right back to us, right? In the sense that maybe we should be driving less or what have you. So anyway, I'll leave that there now, but there's plenty of neat work happening on the political construction of scale and the social construction of scale. You know, it's good stuff. I think we need to pay more attention to it in the GI science community. I think we are in various ways, but there's always room for. All right, and then last but not least, I think I'm actually going to skip this. I think I've already done the environmental thing to death. So network scales, right? About 10 years ago, a little longer, there was a real movement towards really questioning the basis of scale and not questioning it in the way that I'm questioning it here, right? And saying, well, does it exist? And like, well, yeah, clearly it exists, but it kind of really matters where your epistemological sort of basis is, right? Moving towards the kind of relativist end of things is saying, look, you know, there's so many features of our world now that are defined by networks that a lot of our standard notions of, say, scale dependence and variance or hierarchies are making less and less sense, right? And I'd argue that, you know, we clearly can't do away with it. I think scale is super helpful, but absolutely, right? There are these network scales, right? And so we see this with, say, material, right? You know, I woke up today and drank my normal rounds of coffee, and that coffee is clearly not being grown here, right? It's growing somewhere else in the world, and it takes a lot of effort to get it to my kitchen. And we've known this for a long time, right? For hundreds of years, right? Global trade has been a thing. We're seeing this with money, you know, all these sort of big conversations about whether there should be a global kind of minimum tax on companies and so on, right? That's been an ongoing conversation. We're seeing it particularly with the flow of people and plants and animals, right? One example here would be COVID. And I know there's conversations about whether a virus really counts as, you know, or you know, is it an animal? Not really. But you know, with disease flows, right? You know, this isn't new, 1918, and so the Spanish flu epidemic and so on, or the pandemic. COVID has really brought home this idea that normal scale levels may not make sense, right? In an era where we have fairly inexpensive plane travel, which is sort of roaring back, right? And which facilitates the easy spread of disease, it may not make a lot of sense to think about something like, say, health as a purely, you know, county issue or state level or national level issue. There's clearly things that matter there, right? Like we can look at state by state policies towards COVID, right? And see there's clearly scale levels sort of built in there, right? I can compare New York and Minnesota and say Alabama, right? In terms of their state level responses. But there's plenty of things about the way the pandemic is unfolding that go beyond the state responses. They're above or below it, or they completely ignore it in some ways as well, right? Same thing with information, right? The fact that and I love Maryland, for instance. I love being out at UMD. The fact that I'm giving a talk now at the University of Maryland, thank you, Taylor, and I'm talking to people who are just all over the place, right? You know, how many people are on this call? 50, 60 people or whatever. Sorry, down 37. That must be great. You know, that's remarkable, right? And that'd only be happening because we decided to kind of do this big push online. Decided to do the big push online. you know, we have all these conversations ongoing now, right, about whether we're actually going to return to in-person work, right? I'm sure if you're at a university, I'm sure your universities are having the same kind of conversation that mine is having around whether we're going to sort of allow, say, faculty and staff to be located anywhere in the world, right? You could work at the University of Minnesota, but live in the south of France or wherever one lives when one's not in the paradise of Minnesota. Um, a lot of this is accelerating, is what the network scale people would argue, right? Capital is flowing much more easily in many ways. People are flowing in many ways, disease flows, and then information. So much of our economy is tied up in raw information that, you know, it may not make sense, right, to actually think of these pre-established scale levels as mattering as much as they used to, right? Or, right, this ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, right, this idea that, you know, very local things, right? Your ability to get a new car, for instance, or to get certain types of goods and so on, are very contingent on stuff that's happening a world away or half a world away. So thanks, Will. So anyway, I'll leave network scales there now. I feel like this is sort of where a lot of activity is happening in sort of the scale research enterprise. I think the other area where a lot of work is happening is this notion of like the body scale, you know, in the sense that you're, whether it's NIH looking at sort of the gut microbiome, or feminist work looking at sort of the importance of embodied knowledge and so on. So I think there's new scale work happening all the time. All right, so last but not least, right, we've kind of looked at this epistemological scale continuum, right? And the question is, so what do we do with it, right? And I'm kind of like really up against our time here. So I guess I'm just going to throw out this idea that interdisciplinarity is good, right? I find the more that I rub shoulders with and work with folks from other disciplines and ask them about what they think about scale, the better. I think this interdisciplinarity can be intradisciplinarity for geography, right? Clearly, we have lots of conversations internally. It always makes sense to look at scales of observation versus analysis, right? Our data versus what we're going to say about them. Pattern versus process, right? Particularly in GIS, we tend to be very focused on pattern very often. It's good to move into process. And then I guess final thought is that the degree of human influence with the system matters, right? The more humans are messing with things and acting and doing things, the more that, say, social constructions probably add, right? Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time. And this is the link to the article down here if you want to read it. And I am working on another one right now. I just got out of administration, so I'm sure it'll be another 4 or 5 years before I really get back into research, but keep my fingers crossed. All right, thank you very much. And I welcome any questions.